We've recently been overwhelmed with devastating headlines of conflict between Hamas and Israel. Sadly, it's anything but new. This episode was filmed prior to current events, but the subject matter is firmly rooted in the same Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On October 23, 1983, almost 300 American and French troops were killed by the largest non-nuclear explosion since World War II, which consisted of 12,000 pounds of TNT, set off by a suicide bomber in a truck. The 241 Americans, mostly Marines, were there to help bring peace to flaring tensions that spilled north into neighboring Lebanon. For many, there is much speculation and belief around who is really behind the terrorist activities. For those Marines who survived that day, they asked just one thing: remember those who were lost, because they came in peace.
When you were in Beirut in 1983, what was your role there?
I was called the ISMO, which is the Information Systems Management Officer. Now you have to, put it in perspective. This is 1982 and 83. The personal computer just came out in 1981. So computers were still big and bulky, and by today's comparison, you've got more power on your Apple Watch than you ever had in a mainframe, data center.
Amazing.
Back then. So what we deployed in the field was a IBM Series 1 that was ruggedized. We called them the Green Machine. And we deployed them as sort of computerized data entry. So in the old days, if you were back at Camp Lejeune and you were a supply officer, you had your supply orders and you'd take a big stack of punch cards to the data center and they would process it, and then 3 weeks later you get your supplies. So they replaced those punch cards with an IBM Series 1, and we deployed those in units afield. So as you know, Marine Corps is an amphibious force in readiness, and the Marine Air Ground Task Force is the concept that was the norm for deployments. And so you'd go on a med cruise, and then some other group was coming out of the med, and then
Med being the Mediterranean.
There's a Westpac cruise and there's other cruises, but you go on Navy amphibious ships, and then you do training and deployments with other militaries. And then when conflicts arise, the Marines, first to fight, so they were always the first there. And so you deploy with a amphibious air ground task force with a helicopter squadron that's a composite squadron of different types of helicopters, a battalion landing team, which is the infantry unit, along with its artillery assets and other combined arms, and then the supply unit. And back then, the smallest size unit was a Marine amphibious unit. And then you have Marine amphibious brigades, and then ultimately the Fleet Marine Force, you have divisions. So a Marine amphibious unit would be 2,000 people, maybe, and you have an artillery battery, and you have combined arms, and then you have the MSSG, the MAU Service Support Group. That's what I was in, and so we were the logistics unit of the entire organization.
And to kind of translate that into, say, the corporate world as a parallel, you've got sales, which is probably infantry is going to be the best parallel. You've got the general admin and supply.
Marketing is artillery, right? They soften the targets.
That's I love that. I love that. It's a great way. But a lot of people don't think about that there are so many parallels between the business world and the military world. It's just the weapons of choice are a little different.
So supply is the lifeblood of a military operation, and inventory control is the lifeblood of a business, right? If you don't have inventory, you can't make your sales. And back in the early days of computers, there were always backlogs, and so you always had that situation. But the tale of Beirut is a tale of two Beiruts, really. But it also has a long history. So there's a book by Chuck Farrer, who really details his autobiography of being a SEAL, but there's a chapter in there about Beirut, and he does a nice, concise, maybe 1.5 pages of what happened before we got there and what happened while we were there. And so to put it in a nutshell, Beirut's been in the middle of all these different countries all fighting with each other. You got Israel to the south, Syria up in the north, you got proxies working in Beirut. And the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat's organization, was in Beirut and they were launching attacks into, or actually the Lebanese Christian Phalange, I think, they were launching attacks into Israel. Israel wasn't having any of it, and so they started bombing everything in Beirut. And the Lebanese government put out a call, I don't know if it was to the UN or not, but they put out a call saying, hey, we need some stability here. So the Multinational Peacekeeping Force was formed with US, British, Italian, and French forces, all having their sectors of area. And the whole purpose was to create a climate of stability so that the Lebanese government could reestablish its own authority over Lebanon. Well, that never worked. They didn't have much more control over 100 yards from the Lebanese presidential palace. In fact, before we got there, the Lebanese president was assassinated with a car bomb. So we were talking about terrorist stuff. That was the first use of car bombs that we were exposed to. And so one of the Marine...
That was in '82, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. So one of the Marine amphibious units that was there before we got there helped evacuate the PLO. There were scenes on TV of, all these Palestinians on Marine Corps Deuce and a Halfs shooting their AK-47s up in the air in celebration, going to the port to get on ships to leave, which was just insane. So
they were shooting off of our vehicles?
Yeah, like they were being transported to the ships.
They were being extracted.
Right, but celebrating, like they treated it as if they had achieved some victory, like they went into Beirut and they did their thing, and then they left victorious, which I'm sure roiled our guys pretty much, because
absolutely
it's not our mission. But that continued to be a situation where the Marines were placed in a situation where it's not our mission. Our job is to go in, establish a beachhead, and then turn it over to the Army and get out. Right? It's first to fight. And I think there's probably a number of factors that I'm not aware of as to why the Marines were selected to be part of this multinational peacekeeping force. It could be because in 1958 the Marines went in. Under similar circumstances, but much more traditional Marine Corps roles. Or it could be that at that time we started getting into joint ops, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were all cooperating, and that was the beginning of the pre-positioning of ships down in Tampa, the joint JSOC and all those kinds of things. So there's probably a little bit of inter-service cooperation that went into the decision-making to put the Marines in there. But literally, everything that the Marines know to do, like establish fortified positions, set up sectors of fire, went out the window, because the first deployment that we were involved in, so we were 24th MAU, was kind of a show the flag operation. So
this was what year when you got to Beirut? What month and year was that?
We deployed August of '82. And we went to the North Atlantic and we did some training, and then we came into, normally you do your changeover in Rota, Spain. You're coming into the Mediterranean, the other group's coming out. But while we were on our way there, it's either 32nd MAU or 22nd MAU, that group was sent into Beirut to evacuate the PLO. So we took over a couple of their training ops in Turkey and some other places. And then we did the changeover in Beirut. So I'm going to guess it was October-ish, November-ish of '82, because I know we spent Thanksgiving in Beirut. So it was probably September, October, November, somewhere in there.
Of '82. So you go to Beirut the first time in '82.
Yeah.
And then you guys leave out.
So we leave in March, I think. I might have the dates wrong, but I know that while we were back home, and what you do typically as a Marine amphibious unit is it's always augmented from other parts of the Fleet Marine Force. So you'll have people from Force Service Support Group who are on their second pump, others that are on their first pump, and so you sort of replace half the team and then resupply, and you get a bunch of other things going on. Then you head out. While we were there, the embassy was bombed. So this would have been April.
April 18th, as a matter of fact, I remember.
April 18th, and so we knew going back it was going to be a very different situation. Prior to that, the first tour in Beirut was, we had Thanksgiving dinner at the home of the owner of the Pepsi bottling company, who was Lebanese, but his wife was American, and she had a heart for us, and so she invited like 50 or 100 people to come and eat under the tents at the grounds at their place. We went up to Byblos and did some Christmas things.
Very different.
Beirut University, young, pretty girls walking around, Marines who hadn't seen a girl in a long time. Not a good situation, but we kept it under control.
Fought through it, yeah.
And so we leave and we come back, and it's much more of a tense situation.
And when did you get back?
So probably summer, I think, of '83.
Okay, so
Because the embassy thing happened in April, so I want to say May or June,
Okay.
somewhere
All right.
in there. And the one thing too is that I always said if you could rearrange the map, everybody would get along. So in Beirut, you had at least 13 different factions that all hated each other, and they were all situated where this faction would shoot at this faction, and this faction would shoot at that one, and Israel was down here mixing it all up. And so the worst place you want to be in a military situation is in the low country, mountains all around, and we were at the Beirut airport, the flattest, closest to sea level place you could ever be. And we would, I don't know why we did this, but we put our showers on this berm. Probably was a target for us, but we could actually,
on a berm?
yeah.
I mean,
So-
you're skylighting yourselves.
Yeah, but we were originally sent in there as sort of a show the flag operation. We had no idea we'd be the targets, and initially we weren't. But we literally could take our binoculars and watch the war going on. Different factions, tracer fire going up against the mountains, and it was like, ooh, let's watch the.
I've got a picture of you, in the old MASH style showers, look with binoculars, looking out over the city while you're letting the water run on your back. That is weird.
That's exactly right. So we started getting some incidents where, on our second trip back, I'm a believer, and so I had a Bible study, and one of the guys that was in my Bible study was a forward observer, pilot forward observer, out with one of the rifle companies, Captain Mike Oler. And he was hit by a bullet and died out at one of those outposts. Probably poked his head up too far or whatever. So that was kind of one of our first indications that people were actually shooting at us. And over time, those incidents started happening more and more. Because of all of the different factions around us that were fighting against each other, we became accustomed to the sound of mortar fire and knew the difference between outgoing and incoming. So one of the funny stories from there is, and if I can use foul language, we had a two-hole outhouse, we had a two-hole shitter in our area, and our shore party officer, Leo, was up. We had a staff meeting at our place. The MSSG was in kind of a bombed out building that was part of the transportation complex down around the airport, and it was one of those I-shaped buildings. You get a hallway and three wings off
Right.
of that, and I'll talk about why that's important later. But we had our staff meetings, and then Leo would come up from the beach, because that's where his CP was. He was a shore party officer, and so we're sitting there taking a shit, reading the paper, passing the paper back and forth, and all of a sudden we're listening to the mortar fire, and it's like, that sounds like incoming. Oh, that sounds like it's getting closer and closer. And so I said, let's wrap things up here, pinch it off and get out. And luckily, the shitter wasn't hit, but we did have a couple of rounds, mortar rounds that flew into our nearby area. So
That's a helpless feeling.
well, he always says I saved his life, and then he saved my life later, which I'll tell you about around the bombing. But so that's our shared experience, Leo and I,
And it began on the crapper.
on the crapper. Yeah.
So, okay, so what you're describing here, I think it's important for people to understand. The size unit, like you said, was around 2,000 people. You're not all in one place. Even though you're in the same city, you've got the combat element, you've got the support element. You're not all in one location.
Right.
So in comparison to where the bomb actually went off, how far were you located from that?
If you were to look at a map of the city of Beirut, there's a little road that goes down to the airport. So think of any Metropolitan Airport, there's a main road that goes in, and that was a fairly straight road. And down at the airport, the squadron was there, obviously, because that's where the helicopters would sit. And the airport is right at the beach. So one of the runways, the back of the runway, literally is right at the beach head. So shore party platoon from MSSG was there, and we had fuel.
And by shore party, help people understand, more of a security element as much as anything.
Yeah, I mean, Force Recon would go in and set up the area, then Shore Party would come in and build up the beach, and then you have different methods of getting the forces ashore, right?
Yes.
Helicopters, Amtraks off of ships. Interesting experience. Nobody leaves that without throwing up. And then eventually they'll erect a causeway, and so they can bring the heavy equipment, across that causeway. So Shore Party maintains all of that, and they work very closely with the Seabees, the Navy, beach folks, and a lot of construction going on there. Like they'll have fuel bladders that are buried in the sand, and so you can fuel up the trucks and everything, and have the logistics supply route for whatever operation you're gonna do. And then there's a concept called a BLT, Battalion Landing Team. So 1st Battalion, 8 Marines, which will always forever be known as the Beirut Battalion, which incidentally was the unit where the people that were killed that were during the Afghan evacuation a couple of years ago. Breaks my heart. Anyway, so 1st Battalion, 8th Marines would have rifle companies, and then the BLT, Battalion Landing Team Headquarters, and that's the building that went down. So I'm not sure, there was 241 people in the building. There were some survivors, so there was a little bit more than that. Let's say 250 people, and then
Not a lot of survivors.
Right. So the rest of it was rifle companies out around. So you had a ring of control, which was a rifle company in the south, one in the east, closer to the mountains at the Lebanese library, I think, and maybe another one in the north. Then you had the artillery battery, which was an M1908, 155 millimeter howitzer right behind us. And then the MSSG was along that same road, but further up. So we were probably 150, 200 yards from the building. And then the MAU headquarters was across this little plaza from the building. So the MAU headquarters absorbed a lot of shock from the building, and, sandbags falling over. And all these were bombed out buildings. So if you remember, Israel pretty much bombed everything in Beirut. So a lot of the buildings at the airport were office buildings that were, bombed out, and then we just took over and used them for our headquarters and different meetings. So the MSSG headquarters is where we had our, supply tents, motor pool. There was combat engineers, EOD technicians, a lot of different comm, and I was also the crypto guy. So a young lieutenant has 5 different jobs. One of them was managing the crypto assets. So that was the layout of the Beirut airport where we were stationed.
You said essentially you were about 150 yards from the where the explosion took place.
Yep.
Our
building was. There's
your building was.
There's a reason why I wasn't there, which is that other miracle that I was alluding to.
And I want to get to that here in a minute, but before we talk about the morning of, there's an interesting element to this whole thing, and that, like you said, y'all went there. I mean, the phrase is they came in peace. That's kind of the moniker that's attached to the Marine Corps for that mission. But there was a lot going on there. You mentioned the Israelis a couple of times. Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, there were some pretty high tensions between the Israelis and America at that point. Help me understand what was causing those tensions. Because, people now, they look at, we're allies with the Israelis. And it's not that we weren't, but that was a difficult situation. Give the geopolitical.
I'm not an expert in that, so I can give you my best understanding or recollection of it.
Yeah, as somebody on the ground there at that time.
I think we were struggling with our identity with Israel in the Middle East. I mean, Israel's a young country, right? It formed in 1948. Mm-hmm. and there was the Palestinian Intifada. They were rebelling against Israel for taking over territory, and that's still in dispute, in the West Bank and some of those areas. And so I think we as a nation straddled that line a little bit, and sometimes had to smack Israel around a little bit, and sometimes had to smack the Palestinians. You remember Jimmy Carter had that big handshake with, was it Menachem Begin, or was it one of the Israeli leaders? And
I do
Yasser
remember.
Arafat. So that was prior to Reagan taking over, and I think there was maybe some backlash, from that. And Israel was not the best player in that area. Yeah, there was tensions. And then in terms of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, they were in the southern part of the airport complex, and there were some altercations that didn't result in anybody getting hurt, but there was some push and pull between our forces, that rifle company down there, and the Israelis.
So did you guys feel like you were just in the middle of a beehive? I mean, you've got Hezbollah going on. You've got the Shia element, the Israeli Defense Force. The French were there on your side, but there's always been a tension there. What was
Remember, I said there was like 13 different factions,
Yeah.
right? So it was the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There were the Phalangists. There were the Lebanese army, who couldn't control anything, and all these different people were fighting against each other. And like I said, if you could just rearrange the map, everybody might get along. But all that stuff was happening around us. And I think, I can't speak for our leaders. There's actually a good paper or book that was written by General Al Gray and Colonel Tim Garrity, where they kind of went through that fact finding and what are the lessons learned. And there were a lot of lessons learned there. What I remember is the rules of engagement just pissed everybody off. Like, you can't carry around, you can't chamber a round, can't even carry a loaded magazine in your gun, in some cases. And that got a little bit better as the second trip around. But
And see, I'll push back on the lessons learned, because I think there's a lot of lessons we could have learned that we haven't.
yeah,
We've repeated mistakes. You look at the Khobar Towers in 93, or was it 93, I believe, in Saudi Arabia.
yeah,
A lot of the things, there were a lot of parallels between that and what happened in Beirut.
yeah.
So there are lessons I agree we could have learned, not to split hairs, but and that's something I want to ask you about at some point. It's got to upset you that these things keep happening. They shouldn't happen, based on your experience.
Yeah, I mean, just look at that withdrawal from Afghanistan,
Another good example.
Yeah. And, all of us that lived through Beirut are like, oh, here it goes again. 1-8, suffers at the hands of bad decisions. So, I don't want to disparage leaders that have a tough job to do, but I think that we should have pushed back on the mission. But we serve at the pleasure of the president, right? So we're gonna do the mission. But I think that there's a lot of retrospect in that paper, where they said we would have done things differently then. I think too, though, now we've had two protracted wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Marine Corps has gotten away from its amphibious mission, and I've read some articles where we're looking to get back to that. So I think they're calling it the littoral forces, serving on littoral ships and kind of gearing up for the South China Sea stuff that's going on. So
Right.
the force plan for 2030 is going to be a little bit more like the old Marine Corps that, we're an amphibious force in readiness, and you go in, you go out, and you move on. Occupation is not our job in the Marine Corps, and I think it started to feel like occupation, to the point where, and I'll throw out another funny name. So Gunner Allen, Chief Warrant Officer. For those of you that don't know, Chief Warrant Officers are between enlisted and officers, and they sort of don't take shit from any rank.
That is true.
And so Gunner Allen he was the leader of our combat engineer group, and when he was fortifying positions, he maximum fortified those positions, and he used to call it Camp Masada, because he was Jewish, and so he said, this is Camp Masada, and they made him defortify some of those things because it would have the appearance of an occupation force. So there was some discussions back and forth about that. But
Well, and I think that's an interesting point, because obviously, given the year, given how long it takes to become a gunner, he was obviously well versed in what happened in Vietnam because of his own personal experience.
Yeah.
So not drawing, we were talking about some leadership things earlier, not drawing on the experience of those tactical leaders who have that knowledge and experience
Yep.
is a fallacy. I mean, why on earth we wouldn't do that, I don't know. So not to interrupt you, but
Yeah, and we're in a world now where decisions can be made from high levels on right down to the Marine on the ground, through a headset. We didn't have that then. And so the filtering process on how decisions get made is kind of a mystery, looking back on it. General Al Gray, at that time, was the commanding general of the 2nd Marine Division, just turned 95 this year. I hope he's going to be there at the thing because I love that man. But he certainly had the lessons learned from Vietnam. And then PX Kelly, obviously, was our commandant at the time, member of the Joint Chiefs. And so how the decisions were made to put the Marines in harm's way in a way that is not the way the Marines operate still isn't very clear to me. I'm sure that if I went back and reread some of those books and papers, I'd get a clearer picture. At my level, we were just lieutenants doing our job, so it was, a mission that we were sent there to do.
So the job you were doing, October 23rd, 6:30 a.m.
Yep.
It's a Sunday. Your duty station was 150 yards away
Yep.
from where the truck was driven to and exploded. Where were you, though, at that point?
So let me take you back maybe 12 hours prior to that. So I mentioned that as a young lieutenant, you've got 5 or 6 different jobs. One of those jobs was managing all the classified materials, code books and things like that. If the radios go down, you got to go to the old-fashioned, code things. So there's little books of paper that have cryptographic codes on it. So I had those stored in a safe. We had by that time at least 3 or 4 different mouths that were in there, leaving equipment behind, and you only have so much space on ships to take it all home. So we started to have to plan for, because Reagan was running out of time for, I forget what it's called, not status of forces agreement, but there was another name for it. Mm-hmm. And at the expiration of that, you either have to declare war or get out.
Right.
So we were planning for the withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Beirut, and we had to start figuring out where to put the stuff. So I was sent back to the ship to start looking for where we could put our safes of classified material and work with the logistics planners, and there's always Marines that are attached to the ship and big planograms for the ship there. So I was sent the night before, and then Leo, the guy whose life I saved on the shitter, saved my life by radioing and saying, "You can't come to the beach tonight because we're taking artillery fire." What had happened was the Israeli Defense Forces pulled back, and there was a power vacuum, and that power vacuum was filled with artillery shells back and forth with each other, and so the beach was getting shelled, and so we suspended operations to get me back ashore. So I literally went to sleep on the ship and woke up the next morning to general quarters and helicopters flying stretchers into the area. What's miraculous about that is I would have been in the building because Sunday morning we let everybody sleep an hour later. So instead of getting up at 6, you get up at 7. Bombing happened at 6:20. But the cooks, there's a mess hall there, and the cooks all had to go earlier anyway to make food for everybody. And so one of my things I would do on a Sunday morning is get up and go, shoot the shit with these people because they're doing a hard job. And I would have been in the building or in the mess hall right next to the building at that time, but I wasn't because I was on the ship. So I felt very fortunate, and that kind of plays out in my life after that in terms of what do I do with that? Why was I spared? What do I do with that? And we can talk about that. But so I arrive, and it's just casualty control mode. And if you remember, I described our building as...
When you say you arrive, you're talking about on site after the bombing.
Yep, flew in a helicopter with a bunch of stretchers and a bunch of medics.
But before we get there, though, I want... You're on ship when the bomb goes off. Obviously, people could feel it all around the city. I don't know how far offshore you were, but I'm assuming you couldn't hear it based on being below deck.
Just over the horizon, but as we were getting in the helicopters, not soon after we left the ship, you could see the plume of smoke.
Okay, so you couldn't see the plume of smoke from the ship until you got a little bit airborne, so
Yeah.
you were off over the horizon. So describe what's going through your mind and your gut as you're in the back of this helicopter. Now, I mean, it's real now. We know that people are coming after us because by this time you've figured out it was the barracks, right?
Yeah, as soon as we got on board the helicopters, the word had come through that this was, the barracks had gone down, and we knew roughly how many people were there, so they were calling for, the medical assets and the stretchers and all that. Yeah, it was pretty tense, although, you always hear people say you just rely on your training, right? Nobody trains for a disaster like that, but you do rely on just your general training, and so it was very quickly in just action mode. But we knew, shit was already getting real because we were getting pot shots taken at us before this happened, and there was some harassment fire in a couple of places, and so we knew that we were going into a pretty tense situation, kind of like what you hear people talk about with 9/11, right? Running through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, knowing that you're going into an area that's got a lot of danger. So. That's what we did. So I flew in, I quickly reported to MSSG, and kind of at that point you're a servant leader, like where can I help? What can I do? The helicopters would always come in to down at the airport. There was a hangar, and that's where the squadron was, and then there was a road that goes up to the MSSG and up to the MAU, and one of my fellow lieutenants was on a Jeep with a stretcher on it with a body going up there, and so I hopped a ride there. The scene was pretty...
Is that the first time you'd seen any kind of battle fallout?
The scene was pretty crazy. Our building was used as a triage center. So if you remember, I said there were 3 wings and a central hallway. That was the triage center. So you had people that were able to be treated and just waiting for a ride out to the hospital ship or to the, eventually get to Germany. And then people that weren't going to make it, and people that were kind of, we'll call them walking wounded. So I don't remember to this day the groans and the cries and the sounds of that, but there were, because I've read people talk about it. What I remember is the smells, which is odd, but there is a certain smell around death, and I had experienced it in junior high school because there was a mid-air collision right over our development where we lived. My dad was a doctor, so we jumped in the car with his medical bag and we went to go see it. And this was a mid-air collision of a twin-engine plane with 4 people and a little Cessna, and nobody survived. And body parts, and so I've seen that and I've smelled it, so it was familiar.
Took you right back to that.
Yeah, took me back to that. And there's 2 smells that come from that. One is as bodies start to decompose, there's that smell, which is pretty awful. But prior to that, there's kind of a sweet smell. And I don't know if it's the gases leaving the body. I don't know what it is, but there was kind of a sweet smell, and it was very surreal. Because if you look down the road from the MSSG down to the building, and if you remember, there's a little road, the MAU headquarters was here, the building was over here. Everything, and I think I have pictures of it, all the trees were littered with gray dust and pieces of clothing, pieces of sleeping bags, cots, everything just strewn about. So it looked like a hellscape. And so that's what we were walking into. And one of the things that I ended up doing, it was 3 days of no sleep and just pulling bodies out. We had the thing is if you find a person and you pull them out and they're dead, everybody stops and pays respect to them, and then you continue on. But there was one occasion where I grabbed a sergeant and we went into the basement of the building because by then we were dousing water on the building, so there was less dust and putting out fires. The water was going down to the basement where the lithium batteries were stored, and lithium batteries tend to burst into flames when they get wet. So we needed to get those batteries out. And while we were getting the batteries out, we were also pulling out blocks of C4. And so we got them off to a safe position. So I'm, just sort of contemplating my life decisions at this point, saying I'm in a basement with water falling all around me, which the building could still collapse, and I'm pulling out, C4 explosives and
lithium batteries that can get wet, and
Yeah.
and oh my gosh.
so it's just a little blip in the whole scheme of things. But it's like you find yourself in those situations, and you just rely on your training, and you kind of like don't think about it, because if you did think about it, you'd say, am I orphaning I didn't have kids at the time, but am I leaving a family behind to pull some batteries out of a basement?
Well, but you talked about you rely on your training. You also said, though, and I think very poignantly, that you don't really train for an event like that. We
Right.
train for catastrophe. We train for chaos and friction and
Yeah.
fog of war. But how did everybody pull together there? I mean, do you have any memories of just how that all went down?
I don't remember anybody standing around in shock trying to figure out, what do I do next? It just felt very natural. Like our leaders would say, we need this done over here, we need that done over here, let's get this team together, let's go do that. It was just very seamless. To me, it seemed. I'm sure there was chaos and there was a little bit of indecision there, but everybody was kind of focused on that mission. To the point where we didn't really focus on the fact that that road that I was telling you about between the Mao and the BLT, there was small arms fire coming our way there. Not even sure where it was from, but we just pressed on and did that.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that was popping into my head. When you're coming in on the helicopter, the first thought that's crossing my mind is the vulnerability there. I mean, your
Right.
heightened awareness, because they just hit us with, they just got our attention. There's chaos. Now is the perfect time to follow up, from an infantry standpoint, to exploit your gains. And it doesn't sound like that happened in any grand scale, but at the same time, the whole idea of suicide bombings, that was very new. That was one of the first high-level suicide bombings that happened against America.
Yep. Well, they had a second bombing planned that day, and they did. So they executed the French paratroopers, I think, were just up the highway or just up the road. So, they did that. But suicide bombings are not a well-coordinated effort. So there wasn't like, a base of fire that would do an echelon and move in, right? You got one guy in a Mercedes truck loaded with explosives, and then so I think the risk of them following up with shooting some helicopters out of the sky was probably not high, but certainly the helicopters were doing evasive maneuvers and all of that. But yeah, it was definitely heightened awareness. Then afterwards, there were a few other incidents. Like there was one, our building got hit with a mortar round on the roof like 10 seconds after I left the roof. I was the officer of the day, so I was checking the guard posts up there, and it was a small mortar, and it went through the roof, and a couple of Marines were in their sleeping quarters right below it, but it didn't kill anybody. So I think
So literally 10 seconds, you come off the roof and boom?
literally came down the steps like we had a fire escape ladder that went down the side of the building, and it was my turn to go check the posts, and then I came back down, and the mortar hits, and then chaos ensues.
And this was after the bombing.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long after, but it was definitely after. It was not because our awareness was heightened, certainly. We also had spent a lot of time, running to the basement. Like you'd get warnings of some artillery getting too close, and then somebody would ring the bell, and then we'd all just run down to the basement. And so there was already that sort of cadence of stuff happens, and then you all take cover, and then coast is clear, and you come back up and you resume your activities. Because
Who's firing the artillery?
everybody was firing against each other, right? So initially they were not firing anything at us, and so you had
These are short rounds or Bad coordinates.
Yeah, we had Katyusha rockets. They're not very accurate. We had RPGs. Certainly, those were fired from people with, from the shoulder. Mortars of different types. More mortars than artillery,
Okay, that makes sense.
but they're not terribly accurate either. So you'd get stray rounds coming in. But then, we would learn. We had a fairly well coordinated. The multinational force would coordinate with each other. And we always sent an officer for a two-day rotation up at the Lebanese presidential palace to be right there on a radio net, along with the Italians, the Brits, the French, and the Lebanese, so that if things were happening in one sector, we learned about it. Things were happening in another sector. Oh, they were seeing that this group was firing against that group, and then we could figure that things were getting closer to us. It was getting more dangerous. So I think we probably had word. A lot of times when we had an advance notice of some fire coming in, it wasn't being aimed at us, but we were gonna take some stray fire. So, all in all, there was probably 1 or 2 or 3 incidents at the most of that. It was mostly happening, out away from us.
So, with everything you experienced, and I thought it was very interesting that you said you don't remember any of the sounds, you remember the smells.
Yeah.
Decisions you made that put you in a position to still be here today, decisions that others made that put you in position to be here today. What do you take away from, we can talk about, Beirut, and we can talk about all the geopolitical fallout from it and the carryover, but how has it changed Guy?
Well, I talked about it before about in my commercial life, I have this perspective that nobody's got the defibrillator pads out, nobody's having a heart attack. Even though I support a pharmaceutical company that is saving lives, patient's not on the table, right? Or, I'm not being shot at. So I tend to have a perspective of keeping things in perspective and focusing on what's important, not the minor stuff. And so for me, the way I processed all of that was, I've been in worse situations. This too shall pass. I also, as a believer in God, believe that I'm never put in a situation that I'm not prepared for. And I've always felt like my life progression has been one where everything I do has always been built on something I've done before. So all my career changes and job changes have been a building process. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of what I took away from that, is just that learning experience of being flexible, not worrying about the small stuff, and then focusing on people, right? Because our lives are perishable assets. We never know how much time we have. And so I try as much as possible to invest in people. That's why I always think about my business transactional life as a way to be involved with people and to get to know them. I want to get better. I want to be like my commanding officer who remembers names from 1976. I need to learn from that guy. He's really good at it. I tend to, in my older age, forget some things, but the more I think about things and reconnect with that past, it gives me the ability to then be more relevant in my conversations with people.
But he's probably somewhere saying, I wish I could be more like Guy and not sweat the small stuff.
He did pay me a compliment one time. He said, I've really been enjoying watching you progress in your life. And it's like, wow, that's coming from a guy who I revere highly. So I take that as a marching order to continue to be better.
Well, as you know, Carry the Load is all about making sure that we honor those who put down their lives so that others could have the lives that we have. So. Yep. Who are you carrying with you?
3 ways to answer that. One is sort of trite, but our mutual friend Jake Schick from One Tribe Foundation always says all of them. But then if I break that down, it's the 241 that perished on that day in Beirut. And then if I get more specific, it was Captain Oler, who I had at least a personal connection with through the Bible study. And then Staff Sergeant Alan Seufert, who was kind of one of the first people we lost out of our unit. Prior to the bombing, it was an incident that occurred. He was an EOD technician, but he got shot doing his job, and he's from Nashua, New Hampshire, and my commanding officer had to write that letter home So I think of those people, and I think of the community around them. I also am very interested to see at this 40th Remembrance who's going to carry the torch after, because we're all getting older, and some of our senior commanders are really getting older. And so there needs to be people from the generation of the families of the people that survived Beirut, or the families of the people that fell, that need to sort of carry that torch. Our Beirut Veterans Organization slogan is, "Our duty is to remember." And I think, when you think of remembering, it's a passive thing, I remember it, but there's also, you remember that song, Give My Regards to Broadway, Remember Me to Herald Square? That's an active thing of remembrance, right? So
Yes.
remembering Beirut to the people that need to hear Beirut, and that's what hopefully this experience has been about.
And we always talk about, as an organization, the importance of remembering those and honoring them. If you had a message to society as far as the importance of remembering something like Beirut, it didn't change the world.
Yeah.
It didn't even necessarily impact the world outside of the people that were there. Why is it so important for the American society to remember events like Beirut?
A lot of layers to that. One is that, unfortunately, we had an opportunity to nip things in the bud after that happened. There was a mission that was supposed to retaliate for the attack. We were going to do an airstrike against the training base that created the guy who did the bombing. And at the last minute, according to a 60 Minutes interview, Caspar Weinberger pulled out. Reagan he went to bed. It was going to happen. I actually was at that radio net up in the presidential palace. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that there was an operation about to happen, because we needed to make sure that our partners weren't in the area. And then all of a sudden it was called off. Didn't know why until years later, and I watched the 60 Minutes episode. So I think, when there's indecision, or we worry about inflaming sentiments abroad, sometimes we have to do the hard thing, and they didn't do the hard thing that night. And there are people, in fact, at the 30th, General Gray said, we could have, should have bombed them back to the Bekaa Valley. We wouldn't have had Osama bin Laden if we hadn't done that. Whether that's true, whether you can connect the dots there, I don't know. But I think that when we have an opportunity to make those decisions, we have to make the hard decisions. So that's a lesson for the leaders, for me, and for the people that are around us. It's just taking that experience and building on it and making our lives better. We still lose one person or more every time we go back for a reunion. So I'm very passionate about Jake's organization and investing in modalities that can help people with suicide. So, I'm going to devote the rest of my volunteer time to those causes, and hopefully others will do the same.
Guy, I could sit here and talk to you about this and all the lessons and the geopolitical fallout. I could sit here and talk to you about that all day, but I got to give you some of your day back. But man, I really, really appreciate the time, and I'm glad we came across one another's paths, because this has really forced me to go back and remember it in a different way.
Well, thanks for giving us I say collectively us, the Beirut veterans, the opportunity to share that story. And hopefully there'll be more things coming out soon that will highlight that, and hopefully the next generation will take it forward from here.
Please keep me informed.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, buddy.
If this resonated with you in the least, please subscribe and like, and please, please, please share it with at least one person. These are the stories that make us uniquely American. These are the stories that preserve the integrity of our nation.